Dora Baldwin and her Irish connections. The family story unfolds. I've long been fascinated by Dora Baldwin and the mystery of her Irish roots. My research first began with her marriage certificate, which listed her father as Captain Henry Baldwin. This led me to the military records at the National Archives at Kew, but I found no evidence of a Henry Baldwin with a military background. What I did find instead was a Henry Baldwin born in 1795 and listed in Burke's Landed Gentry for Ireland. He was the eldest son of William Baldwin and Mary Kirby of Cork in Ireland, although there was no mention of any children for this Henry. But I was convinced I was onto something, and that's where I focused my research. A family story reconsidered. Growing up, we were told of a romantic tale that my great-grandfather, Thomas Gould, who went to work on a wealthy Irish estate, fell in love with the landowner's daughter. They eloped and they were to marry in Bristol in England. At first I believed this was the story of Thomas and Dora, but now I question that story and what the truth might have been. But let's look at Thomas and Dora's residential movement and how they relocated several times. Thomas and Dora were married in 1867 in Bristol, and they had several children. They had 2 boys. One was called James, he was born in 1868, and one was called Thomas, born in 1869, both in Bristol. Sadly, they died very young. Then they had a little girl called Ellen. She was born in 1870 in Bristol. And then they had 3 sons. William, born in 1872, Reginald, born in 1874, and my grandfather, Godfrey, who was born in 1875, all born in Cork in Ireland after they had moved there. Finally, they had another little girl called Edith. She was born in Manchester in 1877 after they located there. Their movements could suggest financial instability, or it could suggest family connections pulling them backwards and forth. Now let's look at the Baldwin family. According to Burke's Landed Gentry, Henry Baldwin, who was born in 1795, was the eldest of 7 children, and we presume he was the heir to the family estate. However, in the book there's no mention of a marriage or any children, and it shows that he died in 1848. I strongly believe he was Dora's father, but why, you might ask? Let's look at the naming patterns of Thomas and Dora's children. Their firstborn was called James, who was named after Thomas's father, James Gould. It's interesting that Henry Baldwin had quite a few brothers, but 2 of them were named William and Godfrey. These are names that Dora and Thomas chose for 2 of their other sons. We have now found the baptism records for Dora. They're from Kilmurray in Cork, which interestingly isn't far from the Baldwin's estate. On the 10th of December 1838, there's Dora, who was baptised, showing a father called Henry Baldwin and a mother called Ellen Williams. They went on to have 4 more children, all in the same parish and all named as illegitimate. Henry Baldwin and Ellen Williams, an unofficial union. Ellen Williams was Catholic, as the baptism church records indicate, and probably working class, while Henry came from a Protestant gentry family. Their relationship lasted well over a decade and likely didn't result in marriage due to the religious and social barriers. The church records indicate they had 5 children. John was the first one, who was baptised in 1836 and changed his given name to William. He served in the 19th Regiment and saw action in the Indian Rebellion in 1857. He became a captain in the army and went to live in New Zealand around about 1862. He married Janet Curling in 1863. Then we have Dora, baptised in 1838, and is the person to whom our story begins. However, in later records she claimed to be born in the mid-1840s. This is likely that she wanted to appear younger than her husband, Thomas, who was born in 1847, but also to hide her illegitimacy, with further fabrication that her father was a captain. Then came Eliza, who later changed her name to Elizabeth. She was baptised in 1842. Interestingly, I have found a marriage certificate. She married John Illett in Manchester. What's absolutely staggering is the witnesses were Thomas Gould and Catherine Baldwin, both connected to our family. On the marriage certificate, Elizabeth listed her age as 29, which doesn't match what we think is her real birth date. But this kind of age and fact-changing was common amongst all the Baldwin siblings. Elizabeth and her husband moved to New Zealand, where she died in 1930. I met her descendants about 15 years ago, but they really couldn't accept that Dora was connected to their family and wouldn't include her in their family tree. Elizabeth died in 1930 in Wellington in New Zealand. On her death certificate, it says she was the age of 76, which would mean she was born in 1854, which indicates a 12-year difference in her birth year. Now, why am I not surprised at that? And then came the last 2 children, Kath, who was often known as Catherine, and Mary Baldwin. They both moved to Manchester, living just streets away from Dora and Thomas, and they're shown in the 1881 records. The census records also indicate birth years, which were totally different to what their baptism years were. Catherine was baptised in 1845, but the census records show 1855 and 1858. Mary was baptised in 1848, and yet the census records show 1858 and 1861. I was told a story by Elizabeth's granddaughter, who said that Elizabeth and her husband travelled to England to rescue Catherine, who they found living in poor conditions. They brought her back to New Zealand in 1924, where she died in 1932. This all fits in with the records, as Mary, who'd been living with Catherine, had moved to Liverpool and died in Liverpool in 1897. All of Henry's and Ellen's children were baptised Catholic, and in later life they all used the surname Baldwin, suggesting that Henry acknowledged them privately but never publicly or legally. This pattern of age shifting and omission of facts feels less like deception and more like survival. As illegitimate children of a hidden relationship, caught between religious and class systems, they may have adapted their stories to build more acceptability and acceptance in their new communities. Dora and Thomas, romance or reinvention? I am more than certain, after the research I've done and the documents I've found, that Dora was in fact 9 years older than Thomas. In 19th century England, a marriage where a wife was 9 years older than her husband, as Dora was, would have raised eyebrows. It's possible Dora concealed her true age for social reasons. It's also possible that Thomas and Dora invented or repurposed the elopement story to help Thomas's family accept their relationships and also to obscure the fact that Dora was illegitimate. Their marriage, while likely grounded in affection, faced serious challenges. After their early years together, Thomas descended into what we believe was alcoholism and struggled to provide for his family. Stories have been passed down suggesting he became a drunk and a disappointment. And tragically, when Dora died in 1891, she was buried in a pauper's grave. A tragic contrast to her family's genteel origins. It's worth at this point just noting Henry Baldwin and his death. He died in 1848. His youngest daughter wasn't even born. His son would have been 11 and Dora would have been about 9 or 10. I strongly believe that once Henry died, some of the Baldwin family might have rallied around to help raise the children and to help Ellen. I have always thought that Godfrey Baldwin or the Reverend William Baldwin could have supported Dora and the family. However, the Reverend William Baldwin was a lot older, so it's possibly more likely to be Godfrey. These brothers may have supported Dora and her siblings after Henry's death. But then we have to question, why was it that Thomas and Dora only really stayed in Cork for about 5 years? We don't know the exact date that they left. We know they arrived roughly around 1871, and we know that one of their little girls was born in Manchester in 1877. So it's about 5 or 6 years that they spent in Cork. Interestingly, when we look at the records, Godfrey Baldwin died in 1876, and then Reverend William Baldwin died in 1877. When those supports died, the family may have lost both financial and social protection, prompting them to return to England. And we know that it was all 4 girls that went, as we've got clear records now that Mary and Catherine were living just streets away from Thomas and Dora, and then also Elizabeth married in Manchester too. So back to the story that we were told as children. There are 2 theories. Which story tale is true? There are 2 compelling possibilities for the romantic story passed down our family. Theory 1, and one I've been thinking about for quite some time, was that story really about Henry Baldwin and Ellen? Were they the original lovers? Henry and Ellen had a long-term relationship but never married due to social and religious obstacles. Their children were baptised Catholic, but they were left out of the formal family records. The family story of love and lost inheritance could fit into the story. Dora and her siblings spent their lives straddling the line between privilege and exclusion. However, Henry might well have had the inheritance. His father died in 1839, so 9 years later, Henry died, so he might well have had that inheritance for that short period of time. However, let's move on to theory 2. After years of believing in the first theory, I'm now leaning towards this theory. Did Thomas and Dora in fact rewrite the story? Let's look at the facts. Dora was born out of wedlock. She may have needed a respectable story to tell in the community of her new life. She and Thomas created or borrowed the tale of forbidden romance to mask the fact that she was illegitimate, and also there was quite a large age gap. The narrative helped explain their union and deflect from social judgment. Either way, the story is powerful and reflects the need to reinvention and dignity in a society that punished nonconformity, especially in women. A legacy of resilience. Despite the hardship, Dora and Thomas's children sought a better life. William and Godfrey became successful businessmen in Manchester and Cheshire in England. Reginald emigrated to Australia, and Edith and Ellen, always close, later emigrated to the USA. This next generation appears to have rejected the instability and poverty of their upbringing and build new lives with purpose and drive. Before I do my final reflection on Dora, I just want to analyse 2 old photographs, which have been a little bit of a mystery. When you're doing your family research and digging up your family tree, you do come across problems or puzzles, information that is inaccurate, photos that you can't match who's who, dates that you can't align together. So let's talk about this first photograph. We think, and from asking other people, it's dated around 1874, 1875. So let's talk about the people in the photograph. The woman far left, we believe, is Dora. The little boy standing next to her is of the age of about 3. There's an older man, who I think he's older, with a beard and slightly overweight. He's holding a baby we think is about the age of 1. And the little girl next to him is about the age of 4 to 5. So let's analyse this. Dora's age and the children at the time seem to align with the children in the photograph. So the little girl would have been Ellen, the boy next to Dora would have been William, and the baby would have been Reginald. However, the older man just doesn't seem to add up. I don't think this is Thomas. Thomas, bearing in mind, was 9 years younger than Dora. This man looks certainly older than that. The known photo that we have of Thomas from about 1809 shows him as a slim man. The man in the photograph is overweight and has a grey beard, which does not match the Thomas that we know. Theories about the older man. It could in fact be Thomas's father, James Gould, who would have been around the age of 58 around 1875. However, James Gould was a joiner by trade, a working class profession, yet the man in the photo appears to be dressed in clothing that seems to be above that station. The alternative perspective on that is Victorian photographs were often staged. People sometimes borrowed formal clothes from the studio to appear more respectable, especially if they wanted to project a certain image. The other thought is, could this be one of the Baldwin brothers, Godfrey or William? Possibly. If the photo was taken in Cork, Ireland, it's plausible, as the records suggest they were in Ireland at that time. However, complications. The ages of Godfrey and William may not align with the appearance of the man in the photograph, as William would have been in his mid-70s and Godfrey around the age of 63. So it is worth noting the photo staging of photographs. It's true that Victorian portrait studios often provided formal clothes, props and even furniture to make families look wealthier or more refined than they were. Right now, it seems unlikely that this man is Thomas, given the age and the body type differences, unless the date of the photograph is wrong. It could be James, but the professional clothing mismatch raises a question, although the staged photos could explain that. If the photograph was taken in Cork, the Baldwin theory is very plausible, especially if the man in the photograph was older than previously thought. The second photograph is even more of a puzzle. I've tried to have this photograph dated by other genealogists, and they're saying it's looking like it could be 1870s, 72, 73, 74. If that was Dora, the age just simply isn't right. In 1874, Dora would have been about 36. This does not look like a 36-year-old woman. However, if it was Ellen, she would have only been 2 or 3. So it just simply doesn't match. But the likeness to the Goulds and the Baldwins is quite staggering. Our cousins in Australia thought that was Dora, but to me it's just not possible. Also, facial mismatch. Comparing this young woman's face with the woman we believe to be Dora in the earlier photograph, the face shape and the overall features are slightly different. This is a strong visual clue that this probably isn't Dora. So the theory is it could be Ellen. Ellen was born in 1870. So Ellen's approximate age in the late 1880s would have been 18 or 19 years old. It's plausible that a photograph was taken of Ellen at this age, as formal portraits of young women were often done when they were entering adulthood and potentially when they were getting engaged or reaching a marriageable age. Further supporting her identification, we have a photograph taken of Ellen in 1920s when she was an older woman. It reveals remarkable likeness, including similar face shape and the hair colour to her early family traits. So in summary, and based on what we've talked about, the photo almost certainly isn't Dora. Age and facial structure strongly suggests this. It is highly plausible it could be Ellen. Her age fits perfectly if the photo was taken in the 1880s. And the picture of her later in life, the resemblance is clear. I've done my family tree extensively. I picked it up about 20 years ago and spent about 5 years doing it, and I've only recently dived into it again. But the Irish side have always fascinated me, especially Dora. So you can see why I was drawn to this side of the family. And I questioned who Dora really was. Dora Baldwin's story is one of quiet endurance, reinvention, and a complex identity. Whether the original romantic legend belongs to her or her parents, its emotional truth remains that love, especially across class, religion and power, came with high costs in Victorian society. Dora, born in the shadow of privilege, ended her life in obscurity, but her descendants carried her legacy forward, crossing continents and building new beginnings, perhaps driven in a part by the longing for stability and recognition that eluded Dora. Protestant noble